Зараз чекаємо пару хвилин, починають підключитися слухачі.
Доброго дня, шановні учасники і гості нашого заходу.
Good morning, dear participants.
Буквально через кілька хвилин ми почнемо.
We begin our conference in several minutes. We are waiting until all other attendees are connected.
Пропоную зачекати буквально хвилинку.
Just another minute, please.
Шановні виступаючі та слухачі заходу, ми плануємо потихеньку починати, поки у нас іде активне підключення наших слухачів та панелістів. Ми дякуємо вам, що знайшли час долучитися до сьогодні.
Thanks for having found the time to join us. Before we start our discussion, please be advised on the following administrative matters. Simultaneous interpretation is being provided. Please select the language you want. Ukrainian will be on the Spanish channel. So if you need to hear Ukrainian, please click the Spanish button. In order to ask a question, please use the Q&A format. As for the chat, if you want to participate in the discussion or to follow the announcements made by other participants, just be attentive there. As for our rules, please keep your mics muted. If your connection is bad, please switch the camera off. If you want to take the floor, raise your hand. If you have slides to show, please click the sharing button and select the appropriate window. We'll make screenshots, so if the panelists are against, please inform us. The same information will be also posted in the chat. And now I give the floor to our moderator, Harold Japson, Senior International Advisor, IFES Ukraine. Harold, the floor is yours.
Natalia, and I would like to welcome all the participants of this national virtual conference on the 2020 local elections in Ukraine, lessons learned and recommendations. We are joined by 6 panelists for this opening panel, and I welcome both the panelists and the participants from Kiev, from the regions of Ukraine, and from abroad. A short presentation of the 6 panelists. We have Oleg Didenko, Chairperson of the Central Election Commission. We have Pan Andriy Kluchko, Chairperson of the Committee on State Building, Local Self-Government and Regional and Urban Development of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. We have Deputy Minister Vyacheslav Nehoda from the Ministry of Community and Territorial Development of Ukraine. We have Peter Urban, who's the Senior County Director of IFES Ukraine and Senior Global Election Advisor of IFES. We are also joined by Yevhen Poperesny from the OSCE Project Coordinator in Ukraine. He's the Elections and Governance Officer. And finally, Mrs. Olena Litvinenko, who is the acting head of the Council of Europe's office here in Ukraine. And with this, I open the conference and give the floor first to Mr. Oleg Didenko, Chairperson of the CEC. Please, Pana Oleg.
Дякую, тільки я Олег Діденко.
I am Oleg Didenko. Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to welcome you at our conference, which will address the lessons learned and the recommendations of the local elections. We conduct this conference together with our long-standing partners such as IFES, OSCE, PCU, and the Office of the Council of Europe in Ukraine. Regrettably, because of the present situation in Ukraine and all over the world, we have to conduct this event online. Certainly, it would have been perfect if such a traditional conference were held live. It probably would have been more efficient, but I hope that even in this format, our work will prove successful. The last election was very complicated, conducted under very special conditions. So it's really important to address the lessons learned and the conclusions and the recommendations right after the election, when our memories are still fresh. Our conference is also important, and since the Standing Committee of the Verkhovna Rada is now drafting new legislation, and specifically they solicited more recommendations from us on the basis of the amassed experience. So it's real good that we can get together in this circle in order to try to jointly identify the challenges as well as the possible solutions. This is also important in the context of preparatories for the future parliamentary elections. The experience of the local election may come in handy during preparations and drafting of the changes to the electoral code and of other official documents. It's good that there are so many individuals attending our conference, including parliament members, executives, representatives of the judiciary, representatives of political parties, experts, third sector activists, members of territorial electoral commissions. If we listen to the opinions of different stakeholders, will succeed in finding the best possible solutions, as well as in identifying the most acute problems to resolve them in the best possible way. So I'm certain that this wide representation is a prerequisite of our future success. This conference that I have the honor to open is really a unique opportunity to understand where we now are, what we have, what we want, and how to go forward. I wish success to all of us. I hope this joint work will be interesting for everybody. And I hope that we shall reach positive results. I once again thank all those who found the opportunity to join us here. Thank you.
And I will now give the floor to Andriy Kluchko, MP and chairperson of the Committee on State Building in the Verkhovna Rada. Please, the floor is yours, Andriy.
Доброго дня, шановні колеги.
Good morning, good morning, dear colleagues. Can you hear me? I'm pleased to welcome you. We work in Zoom, not offline. Yet I am very thankful to our partners. I am very grateful to the Central Electoral Commission for participation. We have a chance to consider the elections that were held recently, to learn some lessons, to collect the positive experience, and to try to implement it into future practical work. My committee will be attentive to your conclusions and recommendations. We'll consider them and hear them at our meetings in order to make the future electoral processes more effective. And I want to thank Oleg Didenko for all the work done by his commission for the local elections. And I also thank all our partners who participated, who made it possible to hold the elections in a professional manner. I thank all those who were coming up with advice and suggestions. Some of them proved critical. I apologize because I have to rush to the Parliament floor meeting. I hope you will achieve much at this conference, that you will come up with wise solutions necessary for improvements in the electoral legislation. I thank everybody. Have a good day. Please listen to each other. Each of you is an integral part of the electoral process in Ukraine and elsewhere. Thanks, Andriy. Thanks for having found the time to be with us. And now I'm giving the floor to Vyacheslav Nehoda.
The Communities and Territories Development of Ukraine. Please, пане В'ячеслав.
Так, доброго дня, шановні
Good morning, dear colleagues, dear partners, dear participants of this conference. First of all, I want to greet you on behalf of our ministry. The policy of our ministry is to give special attention to the development of local democracy, because local self-government has been in the focus after the Revolution of Dignity, after 2014. This was really one of the priorities for all Ukrainian governments, as well as decentralization and formation of efficient local authorities in accordance with the principles laid down in the European Charter. So that was one of the focal areas of our effort. The fact that we discuss all this today means that we are addressing the outcomes and the results of the last local elections. It's very good that the election took place in spite of the COVID pandemic. At that moment, we were at the peak of the epidemic, yet the election was held, and our agency believes that it was conducted democratically. There were no gross violations, and that's attributable to the good work of the Central Electoral Commission and of the local authorities, as well as to the democratic processes that are unfolding in Ukraine. I also want to stress that the recent election was also simpler in a certain respect. During the previous election, more than 11,000 territorial communities totally voted. There was a very great degree of fragmentation among the local authorities back then, hence that tremendous number. While during this election, we were electing local mayors and councillors in 1,470 territorial communities, and you certainly grasp the difference. So it was a bit simpler on the one hand, but on the other hand, for the first time ever, we were holding the elections in accordance with the changes in the administrative and territorial division of Ukraine, to which we moved after Ukraine, since its independence, had existed for 30 years with the old Soviet division, and now we at last received the new opportunities. So we had a smaller number of communities in which the elections were held, but everything was not that simple because of the short time we had for preparations. And certainly we confronted certain difficulties, including the need to quickly grasp the essence of the most recent amendments to the electoral legislation that was crucial for the electoral commissions. Yet the election took place, and it was a big relief and very important for the parliament, for all the ministries, and this election legitimized, so to speak, the new system of administrative and territorial division at the sub-regional level and at the level of communities. You know that we now have 136 districts instead of 490 as before. So the district councils were elected, although we've had before that many discussions about such councils. However, the citizens went to vote for their representatives and the local governments, and this implies that the citizenry of Ukraine recognized and legitimized by their vote the new administrative and territorial division.
And now we
So
have
now
to
we
analyze
have to
the
process the
processes
results.
Now we have to analyze the processes of operation of local governments, analyze whether this model is effective, because we introduced two models based on majoritarian and proportional election systems. So we should compare them, see which of them is more effective, and thus improve legislation accordingly. And once the next election comes, we would be conducting them with due regard to these lessons. So, and I hope that this conference will provide certain interim conclusions on what has happened during these local elections, and these conclusions will be actionable. And I would like to yet again thank those who contributed to the holding of these elections. I would like to thank international experts and partners who participated very actively and assisted us in organizing, administering these elections. Thank you very much, and let us have a very fruitful day.
And now we are turning to an English speaker, and that will be Senior Country Director Peter Urban from IFES. And I'm happy to give the floor to you, Peter, please.
Thank you very much, Harold. Dear friends, welcome. The local election of 2020 was probably Ukraine's greatest electoral achievement to date. In the middle of a raging global pandemic, the nation implemented completely new legal framework, a new election system, a new ballots for voters to understand and mark, a new way of counting. All of this to the general praise of both national and international observers. And probably most important, without any sign of the election itself leading to more people being infected by COVID-19. We should pause to truly appreciate this achievement. We should be thankful to the commitment of thousands of election officials and to the resilience of the Ukrainian people. To make this a truly epic election season, we, the electoral community, must now round this season off by focusing on what lessons we learned, what shortcomings and weaknesses can still be strengthened through our joint recommendations. And together, we must carry these recommendations to the Verkhovna Rada and other relevant institutions and advocate strongly for even better elections in the future in our joint quest for an ever stronger democracy for Ukraine. On behalf of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, I therefore welcome you, our friends, to this Lessons Learned conference. This event is organized by the Central Election Commission of Ukraine in partnership with IFES, with Council of Europe, with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, their project coordinator in Ukraine, and with ever-present and strong support from our friends at the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, Global Affairs Canada, and United Kingdom Aid. This event will provide a platform for all electoral stakeholders representatives of the election commissions, the state voter registry, government, political parties, civil society, and media to engage in an open and constructive dialogue. No doubt that there's still much critical work ahead in order to further safeguard and build on our progress to date. Together, over these 3 days, we will make a significant contribution to strengthen democracy in Ukraine. Let's get to work. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I give the floor now to Yevhen Poberezhny from the Office of the Project Coordinator's Office of the OSCE here in Ukraine. Please, Yevhen.
Добрий день, шановні пані та панове.
Good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. On behalf of OSCE PCE, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this conference to summarize lessons learned from local elections of 2020. Those elections were the most complex in the history of Ukraine, I think. And sometimes they reminded me of an ideal storm when we had to face a whole set of issues like new electoral legislation and challenges of implementing it. And you will remember that certain amendments were actually introduced at the 11th hour. And we had to apply various election systems at the same time. Besides, we had a totally new election system with open lists, which was something that we didn't have in Ukraine before. New territorial division, administrative territorial division, underfunding of the elections, particularly when it comes to the setting up of the new e-system IFES elections. And to crown it all, we had the pandemic. In spite of all those challenges, I think that we have met all of them with dignity. And I would like to thank the Central Election Commission, whose work was particularly difficult over that time. And I encourage all of you to summarize the achievements and the drawbacks and propose certain solutions so that we could move forward. I would like to thank all of the participants and co-organizers, IFES, CEC, and Council of Europe's office in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zhenya. I would like now to give the floor to Ms. Olena Litvinenko, the acting head of the Council of Europe's office in Ukraine. Please, Pani Olena.
Дуже дякую, Харальде.
Thank you very much, Harold. Good morning, everyone. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, partners, colleagues, national partners, international partners, it is extremely pleasant for me to greet you all on behalf of the Council of Europe's office in Ukraine at this extremely significant event dedicated to local elections of 2020. We were honored to, or we are honored to be amongst the organizers of this conference together with our long-standing international partners, OSCE, PCU, IFES in Ukraine, and the Central Election Commission, of course. This event is a very good opportunity for all of us, for all the stakeholders of the election process of 2020 to summarize our achievements and shortcomings, challenges related to the organization and administration of those elections, which were indeed very difficult and complex, and that has been underscored several times. We faced a whole set of challenges at different levels, of different formats, and we are now to develop recommendations enabling us to improve legislation and its practical implementation in the future. Those recommendations should also assist to implement international best practices in Ukraine. On behalf of our office, I would like to thank all of those who participated in the preparation and administration of those elections last year and those who supported the organization and administration of those elections that were extremely important for Ukraine indeed. The Council of Europe according to its framework strategic document, that is our action plan, and in accordance and in support of the international commitments that Ukraine undertook as a member state, has been cooperating with the public authorities in order to enhance confidence of the public in the results of the elections and the electoral processes, better engagement of national minorities, youth and women to electoral processes. In particular, addressing the recent request by the head of the Verkhovna Rada Committee and on the request of OSCE Human Rights Department, we will participate in preparing the joint opinion on the bill on political parties. And we hope that this opinion will be conducive to further improvement of legislation on political parties so that it fully meets European and international standards. I would also like to underscore the adoption yesterday of the law of Ukraine on all Ukrainian referendum. We also participated in providing certain opinions and recommendations. It is yet a further step towards improvement of democracy. We are all looking forward to seeing the final text of this law on the RADA website, and I'm sure that the Venice Commission's recommendations and proposals will be reflected in that text so that it can be implemented properly for the interest of Ukrainians. So the amendments to the electoral law and provisions that were based on the previous recommendations of the Council of Europe on the change of the place of election, particularly those pertaining to IDPs, but certain provisions on the regulation of local elections were amended in this summer, quite on the eve of the start or of the launch of election process. So I would like to say in this respect that according to the code of best practices code of the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, election systems, membership in election commissions, defining the limits of election precincts should not be revised or amended earlier than a year before the start of the elections. So I hope that these issues will be discussed during this event and will be taken on board when amendments to the legislation are developed. So, thus making all of the stakeholders of the election processes better informed about the upcoming changes in the legislation. So given all of the restrictions and limitations related to the COVID pandemic, we conducted remote observation of the elections by the delegations and the members of the Congress and local authorities, and with participation of experts from the group of independent experts on the local charter of European Charter of Local Governance. A report was developed and approved by the Congress on the outcomes of local elections in Ukraine. And it's my pleasure that today Stuart Dixon, who was the rapporteur of the Congress, would be participating in this event and will present the major recommendations of that report. We also welcome the provisions on the gender quota and the election code of Ukraine, and introduction of the mechanisms to implement those quotas. We will analyze the efficiency of this implementation today, I hope, and we will have a wonderful opportunity to make some conclusions in this regard and perhaps develop further steps. The Council of Europe has got a lot of recommendations by the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, as well as the Gender Equality Strategy of the Council of Europe. The level of representation of women should be at least 40%. So the Council of Europe and our office in particular will be cooperating with the national partners in order to achieve those criteria or those levels. Last year, the alliance or consortium, I would say, of organizations, NGOs, conducted independent monitoring of online media coverage of preparation and just the process of elections. And that monitoring was publicized, its outcomes and recommendations were disseminated, and I hope that those will be taken on board while revising practices and legislation. The use of digital technologies is also in the focus of the Council of Europe and its member states. And e-voting and related standards is the subject of special recommendations of the Council of Europe in 2004 and 2017. And these standards should be observed by the member states if they opt to implement e-voting in their election processes, given that artificial intelligence has started to play the more prominent role in electoral processes. So the Committee of the Council of Europe on AI will be also developing certain recommendations so that human rights and democracy development and rule of law recommendations and standards of the Council of Europe be observed. I would like to thank our international partners, OSCE, PCU, IFES in Ukraine for the long-standing fruitful cooperation and for co-organizing this important event. I would also like to extend my thanks to the Central Election Commission, and I would like to ask you to rest assured that we will stand prepared to provide support in the implementation of election legislation and formation of best practices in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pani Olena. You have made it very easy for me now to conclude this, the welcoming remarks, because you have already started going into the more substantial part. And thank you for mentioning that the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe was present here in Ukraine with was present virtually in Ukraine with a remote election observation mission. We are now entering into the second to the view of stakeholders. We are joined now by 3 of the 4 international missions that operated as observers during the 2020 local elections. First, I would just briefly introduce the panelist here, Pierre Peter. He's the deputy head of the European Network of Election Monitoring Organizations, also called ENEMO. We are joined by Chiara Castaldo from the UDIR, the OSCE UDIR office in Warsaw, who had a limited election observation mission here in Ukraine. And as Olena already mentioned, Stuart Dixon will present on behalf of the election observation mission of the Congress and Local and Regional Authorities. Let me also say that there was a mission from the National Democratic Institute. Due to a concurrent event, they will present some of their findings on the session on Friday from their election observation effort in Ukraine. We are also joined by a range of national election monitors, and we have Olga Ivazovska from the civil network Opora. We have Mr. Oleksiy Koshel from the Committee of Voters of Ukraine. And we will now pass the floor first to the international partners. And I will kindly ask you to limit your speech to the general priorities, having in mind that there will be time also in the working groups to present more details. And I will assign between 4 and 5 minutes to you for the first presentation. And that goes also for our national partners. I give first the floor to Mr. Pierre Pétier, who has joined us from abroad. Good morning, Pierre, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Harold. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this event for inviting NMO to participate. And so thank you to everyone who organized and agreed to participate. I do believe, as Mr. Chairman Didenko said, that now is a very appropriate time to hold this type of event. Generally because things are still fresh in our minds, given that the elections were not long ago, but also specifically in the case of NMO, because we will be publishing our final reports on the 2020 local elections soon, in the next couple of weeks. Secondly, I would like to lead with a positive remark when it comes to the work of the election administration and actors involved in organizing and holding these elections. These elections were not easy, and although one could argue that elections never are, I believe there is enough evidence to support the claim that these elections were particularly challenging for several reasons, including the territorial administration reform, a new election code, of course, a new and somewhat complex electoral system, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and associated risks and limitations. So I do think that praise should be given to Ukraine for managing to hold these elections, which were generally competitive, free and fair, under these difficult and highly complex circumstances. And this is something which, of course, we have taken into account when it comes to NMO's assessment of these elections. So I know that we have many speakers on this panel, so I will try to be as brief and concise as I can, and would use my time here today to emphasize some of the key recommendations from our election observation mission, which we deployed last year, beginning of October, and which continued until the end of December. So for the purposes of our discussion here today, based on NMO's assessment of these local elections, I would start with 3 general but essential recommendations. And these should be considered as, let's say, our priority recommendations. So first and foremost, the election codes should be amended, in our view, to include previously formulated and new recommendations from election stakeholders, including domestic and international observers. And this is something which could be achieved through a comprehensive and inclusive process of electoral reform, involving political parties across the spectrum, but also civil society representatives. And the timing for this reform process is absolutely critical, and changes in the sense that changes to the legal and regulatory framework should not be undertaken ideally less than a year prior to the election, in order to avoid, of course, uncertainty and lack of awareness among stakeholders. So that's the first point. The second priority recommendation for us would be essentially clearer rules for election management bodies, which are absolutely necessary in order to overcome the difficulties and challenges. I'm thinking in particular of tabulation, but also the establishment and announcement of election results. And we believe that legal provisions in this regard should be clear in order to facilitate the transparency and overall credibility of the process. And third important point, based on the assessment and what we saw in last year's elections, is that ideally second runoff rounds, which were held, should be held at the same time across the country. The same as for the first round, basically. And this should be done in order to ensure equality for electoral contestants, but also to enhance voter understanding and participation. So these are the key recommendations I wanted to stick to in the framework of my intervention. But I would also like to mention 3 additional recommendations or points in addition to the 3 priority recommendations I mentioned, because these are recommendations pertaining to problematic aspects which were also observed in previous elections by NMO and which continue to pose a challenge in these elections. And we feel it's very important to, of course, take into account the lessons learned and recommendations from these elections, but also to look back to previous recommendations which were formulated and not yet addressed, insofar as they still concern local elections which were observed. So one example of this would be that despite previously formulated recommendations, NMO observed that the issue of frequent replacements of election commission members, and this includes in between the 2 rounds and on election day, is something that has not yet been addressed. And we recommend on this point that the legislation should be amended to include timely mandatory training and certification of a sufficient number of future TEC members to increase their levels of preparedness and professionalism, but also to limit risks in case of late replacements. Second recommendation, which also is something that we've mentioned several times in the past, is the fact that independent candidates cannot run for local councils, which is something that remains at odds with international standards. Independent candidates should be allowed to run for election at all levels of local councils in line with international obligations and standards. And thirdly, we observe that there is still a lack of online register to publish complaints submitted to the election administration. This is not something new, this is something that is ongoing. But we believe that in order to significantly and substantially enhance transparency when it comes to electoral complaints, the CEC should develop an online register for the publication of all complaints submitted to the election administration, preferably indicating the status and outcome of those complaints. So these are some of the recommendations which were previously formulated by NMO and which remain to be addressed. And the good news is that it's fair to say that they mostly concern all types of elections. So by addressing these points, a lot of things could be streamlined and improved, including looking forward towards parliamentary elections and the next electoral cycle. So I would have, of course, more to say, but for the sake of being brief, I would leave it to that for now, and also invite our participants and the public at large, once we publish our final reports, to look into the list of recommendations we have. I believe from memory, we have approximately 30 points, so 30 recommendations in total. And we believe that those could be very helpful to Ukrainian stakeholders. And as a conclusion, I think it's important to say that much has been accomplished in Ukraine by Ukraine over the years on its path to better electoral processes. This was illustrated, I believe, by these local elections, but also by elections which were held back in 2019. But having said that, space remains for future improvements, and amendments to the election code should be comprehensive and preferably adopted through an inclusive and transparent process in order to bring the legislation more in line with international standards and Ukraine's international commitments. I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you for being very concise and sticking to the timeline. Before I give the floor to the representative from the ODIHR, I would also say that in this panel, we will also hear input from the Central Election Commission, from the chairperson. We will hear Oleg Didenko, and we will also have Mrs. Olena Zaharuiko from the deputy chairperson of the Rada Committee on State Building, who is as well the chairperson of the working group of the Verkhovna Rada on the improvement of the election code. And finally, we are also joined by Mr. Volodymyr Myakokhod, who is director of the Central Office for Decentralization Reform and Deputy Executive Director of the Association of Ukrainian cities. And with that, I give the floor to Kia Castaldo, who is the election advisor with the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw. Please, and good morning, Kira, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harold, and good morning. And thank you also to all of the organizers on behalf of ODIHR for inviting us to participate today. These events and discussions are extremely informative and helpful, and I look forward to hearing the insights and experiences that will be shared. As you know, ODIHR deployed an observation activity to the local elections during the first round from mid-September to mid-November. With a team of experts in the capital, as well as 66 long-term observers deployed throughout the country. Most of our findings from that observation were elaborated in the preliminary statement, which we published the day after the first round, which noted some improvements in the new election code and pointed to successes in conducting elections in such a challenging year and amid so many fundamental changes, which have already been pointed to by many people this morning. Particularly the efficient and proactive organization by the Central Election Commission and other election officials, as well as legislative and sub-legal novelties, which enhance the inclusiveness of the overall process, including the expanded opportunities to update the electoral address and the stronger gender quota for candidate lists. The final report for that observation mission is going to be published this Friday. On the 29th of January, and will contain the final assessment on the strengths and shortcomings identified by the observation team in the election process, and will contain the recommendations for potential further adjustments to the election process. And so I saw this event this week as a very unique and lucky opportunity to share perhaps some of the issues which the ODIHR mission identified as priority recommendations. And so they will be elaborated fully in detail in the report published on Friday. But I thought I would briefly, and I'll be as succinct as possible, share the substance of those priority recommendations on my screen so that you can see the issues that the team has elevated. So please bear with me for just a moment as so just to, I think we're all in agreement that one of the priority recommendations exists in the continued reform of the electoral legal framework, but also in the manner in which it is pursued. So when we say in an open and inclusive manner, to eliminate the remaining gaps and errors and some of the ambiguous formulations that have come up in discussions over the past month, both before and during the conduct of the elections. This should be completed well in advance of the next elections, but also should not be rushed. It should be an open and deliberative process, but it should also be decisive. And I think we've heard all of the benefits of undertaking this process, and we've also heard that there are already plans to pursue this kind of open process. And I know that ODIHR looks forward to participating in and seeing that process play out. Secondly, which has also been highlighted in some of the other reports from these elections, another priority for us is augmenting the capacity of the territorial and precinct election commissions, including through additional recruitment mechanisms, introducing potentially professional selection criteria and compulsory trainings, at least at certain levels. And we also noted that although there was introduction of criminalizing some attempts to bribe or create political pressure on election commissioners through amendments last year, there were not any local investigations in a majority of the cases that were alleged to our observation team. Another priority recommendation is regarding the replacement of TEC and PEC members. And this is not a new recommendation and it's not a new phenomenon, but even after we left the country in advance of the second round, we saw that these numbers continued to be quite high. And so we repeat a previous recommendation related to introducing deadlines and other strict criteria for replacing these election commission members. And restrictive grounds in this case can include, for example, justification and potentially even documentation for these justifications. Next priority would be continued amendments to the legislation, which would create more effective, proportionate and dissuasive sanctions for campaign violations, including campaign finance regulations, misuse of administrative resources, but also instances of vote buying. And that efforts, as always, should be made by law enforcement agencies and clear efforts to promptly investigate these cases. We also have a priority recommendation related to the oversight of campaign finance. And we have a number of recommendations in the report on this issue, but the priority for us is the clear authority legislated for an independent authority with preferably regional representation to monitor compliance with all campaign finance requirements of contestants during the local elections, and that this body be sufficiently resourced to carry out this task. And I've seen others point to, for example, the potential for regional offices of the Central Election Commission or other formulations of providing for this regional oversight. Another priority is to consider extending the deadlines for address change requests and increasing related outreach related to this procedure. This is very tricky, and I know there will be a lot of discussion on this because, of course, the concern is to make, to enable everyone to take this opportunity if needed and if possible, while also considering any potential misuse and not wanting there to be any distrust in this procedure due to allegations or instances of misuse. Another priority is to more strictly enforce the gender quota for candidate lists at all stages of the electoral process, including during nomination and registration. And although we do commend the introduction of the stricter quota, we noted a large number of cases where candidate lists were registered despite not fulfilling the quota. Another priority is to strengthen the sanctioning tools available to the media regulator to enforce the existing legislation. And our report goes into the existing enforcement tools, but we believe that these should be refined so that the regulator can be a bit more nimble to react to violations during the election campaign, and also to address some lack of trust by some stakeholders in the oversight of media to strengthen the requisite professional criteria for appointment to the Regulatory Commission. And finally, authorities should take all necessary measures to ensure the safety of journalists. And we have this recommendation repeated due to cases we note in the report of impunity of criminal and administrative offenses against journalists. And as always, these cases should be concertedly and consistently investigated, regardless of the media or journalist involved. Next, that measure should be taken to ensure consistency in electoral dispute resolution by courts. One particular legal change could be that admissibility requirements could be further revised to ensure that all of these cases that have merit are effectively reviewed and have opportunities for remedy. And next we have another repeated recommendation, legal provisions governing the invalidation of election results and recounts should be reviewed. This refers, of course, to the quantitative threshold of irregularities which would compel a PEC to conduct a recount. but also to provisions related to the ability of territorial election commissions to correct protocols or to order a recount. And we believe that these provisions can be further adjusted. And I'll keep it there. There are 39 recommendations in total, so I've just tried to quickly go through the 12 priority. But I also want to point to the fact that this website on the screen, paragraph 25.odir.pl, contains a searchable list of all prior ODIHR electoral recommendations in Ukraine. And we base all of our follow-up activities between observation missions on the recommendations that were issued by the observation reports. And thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the discussions today.
Kira, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation and for the good news that ODIHR's final report from the limited election observation effort here in Ukraine will be available already on Friday. I think it's perfect timing in view of the next step in the process. And I also thank you for making this PowerPoint and giving us this sneak view of the recommendations. Before I pass the floor to Stuart Dixon, I will just briefly mention that we already start receiving questions. If some of the next panelists will be in a position to answer some of the questions, you can include that in your presentation. There will be a formal section devoted to questions and answer a little bit later. So we will keep asking questions through the chat function. We will not forget your questions, and we will seek to provide an answer to you in a short while. With that, I pass the floor to Stuart Dixon, the thematic spokesperson, who will enlighten us on the findings of the election observation effort of the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities of the Council of Europe. Please, the floor is yours, Stuart.
Thank you, and good morning from Belfast, and an opportunity to speak to you about our remote observation of the elections. Indeed, it's my pleasure to speak to your conference today. I was part of the Congress delegation that held online meetings with local and international stakeholders prior to the local elections organised on 25 October last year. I have to say that for us, this was a very unusual format, participating in a remote procedure, but we do have to adapt to the extraordinary conditions caused by COVID. And I believe that both with Ukraine and other elections which we have observed, that we are managing well in these difficult days. As a result, our information report on the local elections in Ukraine was approved, and accordingly, the conclusions and recommendations were endorsed by the Congress Bureau on the 7th of December last year. I presented the recommendations. Although our report this time did not include the usual resolution and recommendation to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe due to the limited nature of our mission, it nevertheless contains conclusions which were drawn on the basis of our exchanges with a variety of key interlocutors. In order to gather also direct impressions from election day in Ukraine, despite our remote procedure, we did ask for accreditation of a local assistant who indeed visited on behalf of Congress a number of polling stations in Kiev and surrounding areas. The turnout This turned out to be very useful because it allowed the delegation to be briefed after election day and to receive first-hand information. Congress report makes it clear from the outset that these elections were held in extraordinary difficult circumstances, not only due to the ongoing pandemic, but also regarding the decentralisation and constitutional reform, as well as recent amendments to the Electoral Code of Ukraine, which fundamentally changed the electoral system. It was mentioned by some of our interlocutors that these were probably some of the most difficult elections in Ukraine. This resulted in a situation where recently adopted amendments or still ongoing legislative changes created an environment for elections which was entirely new to stakeholders. Undoubtedly, it was a remarkable feature of these elections that there was considerable uncertainty about the powers and boundaries of different elected bodies, and the voters had a poor understanding of how things have changed, what mandates of the elected councillors and mayors will be, and for whom they voted, and what the election will mean, a situation which we suggest should not be repeated. Our delegation also noted that the electoral system put independent candidates at a disadvantage and put them in a disadvantageous position. It doesn't allow such candidates in municipalities with more than 10,000 voters, and we believe that that is problematic from the point of view of international electoral standards. Unequal level playing field for independent candidates on local level is one of the recurring issues that Congress have observed more generally, and it has therefore become quite a subject for our future thematic reports. Also, the Ukrainian authorities could benefit from a transversal report and recommendations in order to further improve the electoral framework and use time until the next elections to scrutinise the provision of independent candidates. Finally, the report acknowledged a positive development that some of the long-standing Congress recommendations have been implemented by Ukraine, notably voting rights of internally displaced persons, as well as, for example, labour migrants who were for the first time able to register to vote in constituencies of their current residence. Regrettably, not many IDPs made use of this provision, and continued efforts need to be made to improve this for future elections. On this particular matter, Congress prepared a report in 2018 and organised a follow-up, a conference in Kiev in February 19 on the steps needed to ensure electoral participation of internally displaced persons. This was an occasion to exchange about good practice examples in different member countries of the Council of Europe. In the end, progress has been achieved, and that is essential. We are aware of discussions about IDPs in Ukraine will continue well after the local elections last year. So colleagues, the topics of IDPs is a good example of how cooperation based on election observation, pragmatic recommendations and follow-up activities can provide benefits for democratic progress in the Council of Europe member states. The situation of independent candidates in local elections is yet a further opportunity to remain in dialogue and to map out new projects. I think I can honestly say today that Congress is ready to again work with the electoral authorities and government in Ukraine to further develop and take these issues forward. We look forward to joining you post-pandemic on the ground and host meetings to discuss these and future subjects with you. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak at your conference today.
Thank you very much, Stuart Dixon. That was very encouraging to hear that you were able to monitor the election, and thanks for the efforts of the Congress in this respect. I should say from the side of IFES that we will ensure that participants of this conference will also receive the documents in due course. It goes for the report that you have done on behalf of the Congress, Stuart, and as well as the other reports once finalized by the ODIHR and the NMO respectively. We have now received 2 questions, and I will kindly ask the coming panelists to address the question. I see that the 2 questions are both from Nadia Marianchuk, and I think the first question will be more appropriate to, and please, Mr. Bedenko, it's directed to the Central Election Commission. If you can see the question, please also have that in mind for your presentation. And if Olga Ivazovska or Alexei Kozhel want to comment on the second of Nadia Marianchuk's question, I also invite you to do so. But now first, the 2 next presenters will be Olga Ivazovska from Opora, and Alexei Kozhel. I give first the floor to Olga. The floor is yours, Olga.
Good morning, dear participants of the event. As the topic of this panel as the general overview. I would not be repeating the recommendations provided by international organizations that participated in the active phase of a campaign. They actually used the data provided by our observers who worked on the ground. We had both STOs and LTOs, starting with the very official start and launch of the campaign, and directly during the campaigning and social media, we monitored Facebook and some other social media, and we also contributed to the training of the National Police of Ukraine. 60,000 police officers were trained thanks to IFES support in the new legislation, amendments to the administrative misdemeanors code and some other pieces of legislation. We also worked with the committee of the Verkhovna Rada, and we called them to return to this discussion when the floor of parliament is prepared to vote in the spring or in the early summer on the amendments to the election code. We initiated the activities of our new working group to develop such amendments, proposed amendments to the election code based on the international institutions' recommendations and those of the local missions, including ours. So I would like to underscore some things or some items that were not raised yet by the previous speakers. First of all, the overall number and activity of the voters was fairly high in the area of fighting for their own electoral rights during the local elections. In particular, about 18,000 of complaints were registered by the national police, and they directly pertain to the violations or irregularities in the election process. When we surveyed the potential voters before the elections, and we asked them about their preparedness to fight for their own electoral rights and apply to the national police, only 16% of the respondents then had said that they were prepared to fight for their rights. But now we can see that the participants of the campaigns and voters are more proactive in promoting their legitimate rights and interests, which forms the positive culture of control and monitoring over the election processes, and thus it actually leads to the political consensus around certain gaps that we still have both in the legislation and the practices, like bribing, voters bribing, etc. So this time, the extent of violations was much lower. When we analyzed the number of those, more than 1,200 criminal and administrative cases were opened, which is much less than after parliamentary or presidential elections. And in the course of the elections, 153 suspicions were serviced to the suspected violators of electoral legislation, so that these cases could be then transferred to court to be considered on their merits. 2,250 violations were registered. All of them are available in our report. We provide information on each of those violations or irregularities, and we are planning now to analyze the results of the pertinent investigations and case law. What concerns criminal violations or criminal offenses, it can take years to get to for them to get to court, because some of the cases that were initiated after the elections of 2015 are still being considered by courts. So we need the civil society to be more proactive and to be more diligent in scrutinizing such cases, just when such irregularities are being addressed by the respective authorities. So we believe that as of today, the effectiveness of the election system per se has not been analyzed sufficiently. And we are planning to prepare analytical materials by the time this working group starts operating, so that they are taken on board by the members of that working group, by MPs and by experts, while they propose amendments to the legislation. By and large, the new system, despite all of the shortcomings or weaknesses and the very brief time for the implementation, is open and is fairly good. Now that we've analyzed the preliminary data, 59.9% of elected candidates have been elected to the local territorial or amalgamated territorial communities that have the population under 10%. And they were distributed accordingly in territorial communities. So here I mean that as of today, the system is relatively open for 40%, and 60% of the distribution of votes in the multi-mandate districts means that the impact on the voters is not absolute. And if the election quota that was introduced by 25% of the entire quota in order to go up the list, so the system could have been better. 52.6% of candidates have overcome this internal actually quota of 25% at the level of the Territorial Election Commission. And now we are worried by some of the proposals by MPs with regard to the revision of that election quota to increase it to 50%, say, or just review the system entirely to make it more closed, I would say. But we hope that it will not happen, because the idea of a reform was focused on the enhancing of the voters' impact on the end result of the voting through these open lists election system. And we believe that gender quota has worked positively to the greater extent, and we can see that amongst the candidates elected to local communities, 29.9 are women, and they received their mandates, which is a relative process, even though 44.2% of women were amongst candidates. We should also revise and liberalize, perhaps, the system of prohibitions or bans, for example, the so-called quiet days, because those requirements were not observed. On Facebook and some other social media, we saw that on the 25th of October, 14,000 ads were disseminated relating to the elections, and more than $100,000 were spent by political parties, third persons, and candidates to advertise their candidates or their parties and Facebook on the quiet day or on the silence day, on Saturday and even on Sunday. Compared to the presidential election, the number of such violations increased by 8%, and compared to the previous parliamentary election by 17 times. So the number of such violations or irregularities testifies that if the administrators of the elections and the civil society cannot stop these violations from happening, then perhaps we should revise the legislation so that we could drop this silence day whatsoever, so that there is a level playing field for all of the candidates and parties. And you will remember that the fine for such irregularities on the election or the voting day is 150 to 170 hryvnias as of now. And we believe that we should also pay special and close attention not only to the procedures of holding the elections, but also to the fact that in 2020, UN proposed a term as infodemic, which means the very speedy dissemination of information that actually distorts the truth, which is a form of disinformation, a misinformation of just in order to mislead the audience or the voters in this case. So Ukrainian elections are not protected against this misinformation flows, and we have to address it somehow. It is an issue not only to those who organize and administer the elections, but also to those who should be in consensus with regard to the election processes. As a result of this disinformation, of hate speech, of this infodemic, we can face irreversible processes in this society, which become particularly acute on the eve of the elections, which are supposed to be free and fair, and particularly free from such interferences. Not only political interferences, but informational interferences as well. Opora monitored disinformation cases in terms in Facebook and other social media, and we responded to such violations. And Facebook, for example, blocked some of the pages that disseminated misleading news, so to say, about the polling results or about sociology of candidates, regarding candidates in the local elections. So the European Union is paying very close attention to disinformation and its impact on elections. And we are guided by the standards, which are European and international best practices. But in Ukraine, alas, we haven't got this public and in-depth discussion of these matters. So, and we are not a subject, but rather an object of certain experiments with the use of personal data, with data of potential voters by Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. So, because these data are kept by the Google and might be stolen or misused in the interest of certain candidates or other malign forces.
Well, the present system, the outcome was that 5 days delay, which somehow jeopardized the process and made candidates unequal. If the election was held on the 25th and the second round was announced in some cases 2 weeks later, and in other cases 4 weeks later. It created problems because some candidates had less than 1 week for campaigning, while other candidates in other locations were in a better position because they could campaign long term. We think that more discussions should be held regarding publication of the election results, because this is what shapes the trust of the citizens. Not all journalists and not all voters can understand why the Central Electoral Commission cannot process the incoming data faster. And here I imply the role of the territorial electoral commissions. However, the request within the society is for the central data bank. Therefore, data should be collected more promptly and made public more promptly, although the CEC is not a key player in the local elections process. And let me now say something about election finance and relevant reporting. Much has to be improved. Under the present system, interim reports are provided by the candidates and by the political parties, but it is not possible to check on these reports in a professional way, and therefore we need to involve other participants in order to put an end to violations on the part of those who ignore the requirements of the law. Thank you.
For this very comprehensive and detailed overview, and also for bringing new aspects into the discussion and tabling ideas. Is there a need for modifying the electoral systems? Should we in Ukraine have a more liberal attitude towards campaigning on election day, and the whole issue of coordinating second rounds in the interests of providing a level playing field for the candidates in such second rounds. Thank you very much for these ideas. There will be an opportunity to discuss them further in detail. Also invite for questions and comments on this. But first, I will give the floor to the Committee of Voters of Ukraine, to Pan Oleksiy Koshel, please.
Доброго дня, шановні колеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I am so pleased to see you all. It's a very important discussion that we are having. It is important that the representatives of the parliament majority made public promises about the new stage of law drafting. The working group is about to begin its work. But it's important that the changes are not just technical or narrowly targeted. It's important that we really arrive at a new stage of the reform of the election-related legislation. There are many controversies. There are very many different proposals. I'm not going to speak about them in detail. During the election, more than 2,000 observers were working on behalf of our organization. Some of them worked long-term, some of them on ad hoc basis, plus members of our mobile teams who were rapidly responding to violations. I invite you to visit our webpage. I think most of you have read our materials that have been circulated to the authorities and among broad public. And now we are waiting for the changes in the law, but it's important that these changes are not narrow. For example, in the government authored draft, the only problem addressed is that of the so-called twin candidates or replica candidates. And I'm really surprised by the Cabinet of Ministers submitted a draft law which addresses only one particular problem in the course of elections. As for the key issues during the elections, we noted several. For example, failure to comply with the electoral law's requirements on advertising materials. Some of them carried no data on the source, and that happened in all regions of Ukraine. It's a big issue because it's not about how the campaigning materials are marked, but there is also a possibility of a shadow financing of election campaigns. Very often municipal resources were used in campaigning for political purposes. That was noted by a number of our observers. Voters were bribed at the local elections. It was a broad-scale issue. For example, foodstuffs were handed out or other consumer goods. A specific feature of this campaign was that voters were provided free of any charge with masks, disinfectants, etc. In spite of the legislative ban, parties and candidates were also handing out the traditional foodstuff packages. Our committee is worried by the scale of changes of addresses in specific communities, which resulted in the emergence of the technology of electoral tourism and could impact the results of the vote. We checked on information received from our observers. And this effort made it possible to identify at least 20 communities where the number of new voters was excessive. Like, for example, the Karolina Bugaz community in Odessa region, where the number of voters all of a sudden increased by 13%. This problem of electoral tourism is noticeable and considerable and should be addressed legislatively. We should also underscore the importance of the solution of the issues that labor migrants or IDPs face. However, in general and by and large, we think that the mechanism under the Electoral Code was not successful because it gave birth to the large-scale problem of electoral tourism. And secondly, many artificial barriers remained to those who wanted to change their electoral address. Only 100,000 electors did that, less than 2% of the total number of those who could make use of the procedure. And according to tentative estimates, now in Ukraine, there are 5.5 to 6 million residents who reside not at where they are registered officially. So we think that this issue deserves full-fledged solution in order to put an end to any application of the electoral tourism technology. Problems of IDPs, problems of labor migrants and of other vulnerable are not only the issues of the electoral legislation. These issues also have to do with the respect of social rights. And as a solution, we see only one way: changes in the legislation where it concerns the procedure of changing the address. The Eighth Parliament developed a number of relevant ideas, including a simplified procedure of notification of the change of the residential address, as per the Canadian or the German model, that will allow a quick reform in the registration of residents, and our labor migrants and IDPs will become full members of their local communities, able to implement their rights. In our reports, we also make note that not all authorities were ready to hold elections against the backdrop of the pandemic. Many decisions were passed with delays right in the course of the electoral process. Several times our committee appealed to the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine and even to the prime minister in person. The prime minister responded promptly. He assigned relevantly a number of agencies, but apart from these general recommendations, no specific efforts were taken in order to properly organize the election in the COVID-19 pandemic situation. Our committee think that the decision on the reserve fund used for for financing was incorrect, especially in the situation of the pandemic. Social distancing was not always observed, and our observers noted that not all voters were wearing masks. Thermometrical control was not proper in a number of instances. Our organization furnished examples of very bad thermometers that were showing the temperature of human body to the tune of 29 degrees or even less. So we think that the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine should also, in a centralized way, resolve the issue of procurement of masks, thermometers, as well as paying for the services of janitors who do the cleaning on the election day. On the last day of March, a number of extraordinary elections will take place. So I think that the Cabinet of Ministers should really solve that issue of centralized funding. And let me now draw particular attention to one other issue. The failure to respect the rights of the vulnerable. Most of the polling stations were not accessible. We saw many stations with no ramps. We saw many not on the ground floor, but on the first floor. This problem should be resolved in the course of the law drafting effort, because provisions of the law should not create difficulties for those who are partially sighted. Well, I refer specifically to the prohibition to photograph or to video the ballot. but those who have problems with their site use special applications in their smartphones so that without any external help, they can fill their ballot out. And our observers noted several instances of problems at the polling stations with permissions to make use of such applications in the smartphones. And we think that the revised code should take heed of that. We very much count on the effort of the working group and on the future changes and amendments in the code. However, such amendments should not be too narrow. We need a full-fledged due stage of the electoral reform with important amendments to the law, with a new law on the changes in the registration of residents, changes in the law on political parties, etc. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexei, for giving us all this food for thought. I'm happy that you have calls to the Verkhovna Rada and to the further development of the election code and other legislation. After our next speaker, who is Mr. Oleg Didenko, we will have an opportunity to hear directly from Ms. Alina Zaharulko from the Rada committee. But first, I give the floor to Oleg Didenko. Please.
Дякую.
Thank you. Dear participants of the conference, for this overview of the electoral processes, I would like to respond to some of the recommendations and raised issues. First of all, this was the first instance of elections that the new CEC administered. The local elections for CEC are, as I said before, both easy and challenging. They were easy because it's not our primary responsibility to organize the relevant processes. On the other hand, just because of that, we had a very little leeway in terms of responding to certain claims, complaints, and irregularities. These were elections at different levels at that. And as many of the speakers said before, and I'm glad that we are all in accord here, that these were the elections held under unprecedented conditions. So last year, we lived through the so-called election revolution with a totally new election code, with a new administrative and territorial division, plus quarantine restrictions and the requirements set as a result. Besides, some of the speakers noted the lack of funding. However, despite all of those difficulties, the elections were assessed by the observation missions, including domestic and international, very favorably, by and large. Of course, the credit is due not only to our organization, but all others. The parliament that improved legislation till the very end, then other public authorities, cabinet of ministers, local self-governments, particularly in what concerns enforcing quarantine restrictions and requirements. Of course, there were some glitches and wrinkles that we had to observe ironing as they happened. But again, as I said, generally we can say that the elections were held safely and in an orderly manner. The National Police of Ukraine contributed to that as well. They interfered when necessary, and they sometimes prevented certain violations. And I also appreciate the activity of the voters. The turnout was fairly high, and voters actually are not prepared to bear with certain violations, and they insist on keeping all of the procedures in order. So the civil society contributed as well.
Було набагато легше забезпечувати організацію виборчого процесу.
Hence, it facilitated the work of those in charge of organizing these elections locally, at the local level, at the regional level, and to us as well. Particularly, territorial election commissions were the most active, and PECs also worked under very challenging conditions. But they were very dedicated in order to make these elections happen in an orderly, due, and well-organized manner, for which I'm very thankful to all of them. Thanks to this concerted effort, we managed to hold free and fair elections, and it is very good that several organizations held a number of roundtables and other events to discuss the outcomes of the elections and to propose certain recommendations. We are particularly thankful to or grateful to our international partners for their detailed recommendations. As far as the challenges that we faced are concerned, we try to respond promptly to the arising challenges or issues. And CEC inter alia also participated in developing recommendations on improving legislation. We undertook responsibility to propose certain changes to make regulation of the election processes better. The election code and amendments thereto were adopted very quickly and very late before the elections, you will know. And the new legislation, the new fairly complex election system was implemented, and we are thankful to our international partners for their assistance with training all of the stakeholders. The issues with underfunding and impossibility to actually include a territorial election commission commissions into the electoral systems or electronic systems in order to make their life easier on the election day and the day after actually was a problem, but we cooperated with several international partners to eliminate those problems on the day of the elections and on the voting day and the day after when the tabulation started. So CEC was very active in developing recommendations and the implementation of those recommendations together with other stakeholders. We try to pay due attention to a number of issues. Perhaps many things could have been done better, and today we are here to discuss those outstanding issues. So we will be working with you to make it happen. So we have developed our own proposals. Many of them will be discussed by the working group to be established very soon. And I would now highlight those which CEC needs to underscore as the organizer and administrator of the elections. That's the effective operation of territorial election commissions, enhancing their qualifications, building up their capacity, training, and perhaps mandatory certification of the members. And perhaps analyzing how members of TEX can be replaced and all of the criteria related to that. Because untimely or late replacement actually hinders the due procedure. We had several cases when just the heads of territorial election commissions were replaced several times during a week preceding the elections. So that's the problem that we faced. And we need to find ways to enhance responsibility and accountability of territorial election commissions. So I cannot say that we identified lots of cases of bribery or undue performance by the members of TEX when they failed to implement the decisions of or instructions of CEC, but even the court decisions for which they are actually administratively culpable or liable. So, and when such decisions are not implemented, it is next to impossible to actually abide by the law and fulfill all of the legal requirements. So I hope that we will discuss how to do that over these three days. So how to address the early delisting of the members of the territorial election commissions, because their replacement, if it is still based on the quotas and political principle of their formation, hinders their effective performance. And here the issue of individual liability is raised because not all of the members of the commissions were brought to answer as required. So perhaps the introduction of some individual liability up to criminal culpability of individual members of such commissions, in spite of the available decisions of courts or CEC, should be envisioned in the law.
Наступним таким серйозним напрямком це
Another large area of issues that we would like to discuss with you today and over the next 2 days is how election systems were applied during local elections and how those can be improved further. Just without politicizing this issue, we should look at territorial organization of the elections and the level of regulation of the formation of electoral districts by the electoral code. Because in practice, we had subjectivity in addressing those issues. Some mistakes, flaws, and sometimes even abuse. So I think we should consider more closely how to regulate these issues at the legislative level. And I think it is extremely topical that we develop clearer criteria for division of territorial communities into election districts. Particularly when it comes to cities or towns without a division into rayons, for example, districts, sorry. I am not ready to come up with some solutions or proposals right now, but for these districts to be formed properly and clearly so that both the commission members and the voters understand them and the candidates also understand them better and be guided by those criteria in their campaigning. Why they should be running in this very district and this very locality. Another issue of a global nature, and we believe that once we address it, we can improve the quality of election processes and tabulation, is defining additional ground for disqualifying heads or members of election commission if it is established that certain violations were carried out or occurred during the registration, because in practice for lack of certain safeguards, and when sometimes because of mistakes or some outright abuse, the candidate can be actually even if they are not elected by the majority of votes, are nonetheless appointed heads of or mayors of villages or heads of local councils. And CEC has had several such cases and had to post an order when we received complaint from one of the communities. And it would be a good idea to hear from the conference participants how to address this issue. At the stage of the candidate registration, since case law is not very clear and uniform, we had some difficulties with the deposits to be paid by parties. And when it comes to the non-observance of gender quota, perhaps we should pay special attention to that and have it better regulated in legislation, be it primary or secondary legislation. We should also think of how to improve electoral procedures, simplification of those procedures, because the experience of the last election testifies that the new election systems, particularly when several such systems are being used at the same time, create some difficulty and challenges for the election authorities and the voters. So with the party lists, the election commission's life was made easier because it was easier to calculate the results. But we expect that the difficulty will be growing. And if there are ways to improve such procedures, we should think of them. And one more thing, if I may. We should also discuss the opportunity for the citizens to use their passports electronically on the DIA platform, because so far we haven't got a clear answer to the questions that citizens often ask. The current legislation does not provide for such an opportunity or possibility. On the other hand, there are issues with the technical capacity for the election commission members to check that electronically. And if such readers be provided to the present election commissions, who will pay for that is a question. So some of PECs allowed to use this form of passport, some didn't. So I think we should discuss it broader and have some clear position on this score.
Well, I could speak at more length. I think that some other proposals will come from other members of CEC or from our secretariat. Special attention should be given to the recommendations from the observers. And we are very grateful to them for their participation in spite of the difficulties. The missions worked, the missions came up with their recommendations, and that will certainly imply further improvements in the legislation. And now I'll just say thank you for your attention, and I wish effective proceedings to all of us. Let us all hope that by joint effort we'll improve our laws and the way they are applied. Thank you.
Like I would say the main takeout from you is that you will continue, will continue to be an active player in bringing feedback on what is needed on the legislative level. And we will hear now from Ms. Alina Zaharoiko on the further plans of the Rada in this respect. But I also take away from your presentations that you invite participants of today's conference in giving concrete recommendations to what the Central Election Commission can improve in its policy and its in regulation of local elections. So thank you very much for being so open and inviting us to also assess and give feedback on the work of the CEC here. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Alina Zaharoiko from the Deputy Head of the Parliamentary Committee on State Building. Please, Pani Alina Leonid.
На жаль, з пані Аліною пропав зв'язок. Я думаю, вона зараз...
We don't have the connection with Alina, but let's hope that she will turn up here soon. So let's demonstrate some patience and wait until she's back with us. Well, let us give the floor then to Volodymyr Mягкоход. Are you here, Volodymyr? Yes, I am. I am Volodymyr Mягкоход from the Association of Ukrainian Cities. I welcome all participants of this event. It's great we have this chance to exchange. Prior to these elections, the rules of the game were changed again right before the election, and that certainly complicated the life of those who run as candidates, as well as of those who were doing the tabulation. Apart from that, we saw a very complex system, hard to understand, especially in view of the lack of time. So I think it would be important to have mercy on members of electoral commissions, because if things go on the way they go now, we'll have no persons willing to become members of the commissions. Our association said that it is not a good idea to increase the role of the political parties during local elections. We believe that at the local level, the elections are to be conducted on the majoritarian basis for a proper linkage between a councillor and his or her elector. Many times we saw instances when councils do not function properly because of multi-partisan strife. Moreover, political parties have their own agendas, and some councillors often try to address and resolve issues that have nothing to do with local government, and who at local election campaigns speak about some matters of national importance. Sometimes political parties on their slates have individuals who don't have the slightest idea about what positions they run for and what they will have to do in their positions. This is a problem that has existed for years. We have to think more about the moral and intellectual level of preparedness of such individuals. We often discussed the imperative mandate issue, and we envision more issues. And once again, that's connected with the role of the political parties. Locally, much depends on individuals, and some of them are too much connected with their parties and are not connected with their voters. Other speakers have addressed many technical issues. I will mention just one thing. Compensations for use of property and of payments for utility bills. This is a problem that is reported to us from different locations. Moreover, the dates of the locations, the dates of the elections are set only twice a year. The peak is over. But if, for example, the election is conducted in Kharkiv right now, then at the forthcoming election, the turnout will be very small. So we all have to think again about how frequently to conduct the elections. And I think that I'll stop here, although I could say much more. But in view of the representative nature of our conference, I think that we'll cover very many matters. Thank you for your attention.
And I should say that we are still trying to reconnect with Alina Zaharuko in Verkhovna Rada. She has some technical glitches at the moment. We will give the floor to her as soon as she's back online. I hear that she's not online yet, so I will basically start the questions that we have got. There are already questions in the chat function. I have two questions, I think, directed to the Central Election Commission. The first question is regarding the faith of the local voter register maintenance bodies after the territorial reform. Have they all been re-established? Are they functioning? And were there any problems in the process that affected the local election process?
Пане Володимире, викличіть, будь ласка. Щодо реорганізації відділу ведення реєстру, так.
Well, as for the registers, the administrative and territorial division of Ukraine has changed. Administrations are reorganized. There are relevant structures authorized to maintain the register. This system will be reorganized, and the register will be maintained by the representative offices that we want to establish, although the law on the budget of Ukraine for this year does not provide the respective funds. That's why establishment of this territorial authorities was postponed. However, the existing structures will become larger in the towns that are the centers of the new districts. Probably some individuals will have to move from where they live now to other towns. but regrettably, all this matter cannot be fully resolved by our commission. Yet we understand the issues. We try to do what we can do, but that's the situation presently.
Mr. Lektudenko, there was one question also regarding the training for territorial election commissions. I think this is the speaker has in mind if there will be continued training for territorial election commission that will be conducting the reruns that are still to come of events linked to the election events linked to the October 2020 local elections.
Yes, well, the Central Electoral Commission sees as a priority raising the level of professionalism of the members of electoral commissions. We hope that the membership of these commissions, of the territorial commissions, will not change drastically. However, some changes may be so far-reaching that more trainings will be required. It is also worth remembering that members of the commissions are not receiving remuneration for their work, and their attitude to participation in training is not uniform, as well as to certification. However, we believe we'll find a full-fledged solution both to the issue of additional training and to certification. We have our training center, as you know. The law also provides for a separate training center as a legal entity, and we are making progress in this area. Thank you.
I would like now to open the floor for other questions. I remind that also panelists can ask questions to each other, and hereby I announce the floor open for questions and answers. I should say that we have heard back from Ms. Alina Zaharujko. Unfortunately, she is not able to connect to us, but she asks us to convey that she will, let me see here, передає, що всі зауваження та рекомендації будуть взяті до уваги та ґрунтовно проаналізовані. So this is very encouraging. We hope that she will be able to connect us maybe during the session on Friday, so we can hear back on the concrete plans and her opinions. But please, if you have questions, it's time to ask them now.
Можна, Гарольд?
Будь ласка, пане.
Дякую. Я би хотіла відповісти на питання, які в чаті.
I would like to answer those questions which are in the chat about gender quotas and specifically the procedure of validating the party slates. There is some legal uncertainty presently, and it should be fixed by a law. We have some experience, we have some good practices, and really we saw a lot of creative efforts, both by the political parties and by the commissions, with regard to how to bypass the gender quotas. I'm sure that the working group will work on that, and it's really important to have a safety catch in order to ensure the gender quota compliance, not only at the stage of submitting the slates, but also at the stage of registration, in order to avoid manipulations with the slates when some candidates may be crossed out on the grounds that not a full package of documents was provided. And we've been observing some systemic manipulation in this regard. It is necessary to change not only the legislation on the elections, but also the laws on the political parties. The parties that are presently in the parliament were not ready to make the procedures of party congresses more transparent, which would ensure a clear view of what candidates are supported by the political parties. And the same, by the way, pertains to the possibilities available to the CEC at the stage of parliamentary election. Presently, this draft procedure already exists, and the failure of the law to regulate right now is certainly a deficiency, because the belief is that the political parties should be doing that themselves. We were involved in the drafting of the law on the political parties. It will be presented on Monday. It was the preliminary Congress or conference procedure that we try to regulate. So the working group should consider a wider range of requirements regarding the gender quota, and failures to comply with the quota should not be deemed technical mistakes, as they were. And thus, those who were submitting the packages of documents could manually change the list, which was in fact forging the decision of the political conference. Therefore, these two major amendments are required to the Electoral Code. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Olha. Any other questions? Then I would like to read some of the opinions that we can read in the chat. After introducing amendments to the election code, will there be a need to seek opinion of the Venice Commission or OSCE or DEAR after such amendments pass the first reading, do you think? The panelists, what do you think? Will a separate opinion of the Venice Commission or DEAR be necessary? So if I can, I will grab the floor now. I believe that a joint opinion of the Venice Commission and OSCE or DEAR would be very useful, because the amendments will affect the election processes, and their opinions actually set up European standards. So in order to obtain this opinion, Verkhovna Rada can send their request to this effect. But any assessment and any opinion should be provided in due time. So if we are going to have elections in October, so such opinions should be sought and actually provided well in advance. So, the campaign, if the elections are to take place in October, then the amendment should be introduced a year before. So I believe that today it's quite difficult to assess what timeframes to envision for the application of such amendments, and but we need an opinion on Book 4 on local elections. And those recommendations can affect all other election campaigns. Since we haven't got Alina with us, but preliminarily we discussed with her that it would be very good if Parliament could, by the end of this session, the spring session, they could finalize the work of the working group with proposed amendments to be considered in the first reading. So, and the next session till the end of July could actually consider such proposed amendments and thus seek recommendations from international partners. Thank you, Olha, for sharing your opinion with us. So joint opinions of the Venice Commission and OSCE or DEAR can be provided according to the simplified or expedited procedure. So we can hope that they would apply this expedited procedure if need be.
Okay, I will switch to English. I was taken away by speaking Ukrainian. I see also we still have Udir here. I don't know if Udir wants to say a comment if that is feasible to have a joint opinion also on the election code, but after the first reading of the or hearing of the election code amendments, expected amendments sometimes over the summer.
Thank you. You've covered all of the technical needs that would be in place for us. We would have to receive, of course, the request in a timely way, also together with the Venice Commission, and it would depend, of course, on their protocol for the expedited opinion. But we certainly did a similar exercise last year with the opinion on the draft referendum law, where we had an expedited procedure where we were able to hold the consultations and produce the draft opinion in just a matter of a few weeks. So hopefully if the need was realized and the interest was there and we received the request quickly enough, we could certainly proceed this way.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Other comments, other questions? If not, then I will pass the floor to Natalia Ulyasiuk, just to, before we close this session and take a lunch break, just with a reminder on the work in the afternoon, where we'll split into sections into working group based on themes. Natalia, I hand over to you. And I also use this last opportunity to thank all panelists and all those that have contributed with questions and also for your time and interest in this. And I wish you fruitful following days of this conference. Natalia, the floor is yours.
Дякую, Гарольд. Дякую всім учасникам.
Thank you, Harold. I would like to thank all of the participants as well. Several technical or housekeeping moments. After the lunch break, we will have work in groups. The first of them will be on the organization of activities of Election Commission, and then improvement of election systems. We will start at 1 p.m. and we will be working for 90 minutes. So please opt for a group that is of interest to you and join in. Tomorrow, there will be 6 working groups working at the same time. They will work for 90 minutes in the morning, then they will have lunch break and 90 minutes work after lunch, that's in the afternoon. The discussion on the 29th, that's on Friday, will also be streamed live. And if you have any questions as to the topics of the group that you would like to join, please contact me. And I would also like to thank Harold for moderating this discussion. Thank all of the panelists and participants. So see you at 1 p.m. Thank you and stay safe.